So welcome everyone to New York Buddha Dharma. And tonight we're talking about some very basic Buddhist doctrine. I sent you all something I just you might keep around for a souvenir if you wish. It's a schematic or just a list of the basic structures of the Tibetan Buddhist path. And these are called yanas in Sanskrit, tekpa in Tibetan, and it means vehicle, like a cart. And there are, we basically in this tradition that I come from and that you all are a part of now, studying in this tradition, we're coming down through a lineage of teachers, primarily Kagyu, four main sects of Tibetan Buddhism: Kagyu, Nyingma, Gelugpa, and Sakya. Dalai Lama is Gelugpa. And Chogyam Trungpa, who was my teacher, my root guru, was a Kagyu, but his root guru, Shechen Kongtrul, that means Jamgon Kongtrul of the Shechen Monastery, was Nyingma. And so Rinpoche received both lineages and passed them on to us. And in fact, he preferred the Nyingma scheme. And in the Nyingma scheme, there are 9 vehicles. In the Kagyu scheme, there are, I have to count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. They both are the same in the Hinayana and the Mahayana. These are the Hinayana vehicle, means the lesser vehicle, has 2 subdivisions. If you open up that document that I sent you, or if you want to, you'll see this. It has 2 subdivisions. The first is called the Shravaka Yana. This is all the Sanskrit words, which means the vehicle of the hearers. And this is where you enter the path. You enter the path as a listener who listens to the teachings and absorbs them that way, and also begins practicing meditation. This is called the lesser vehicle. It's sort of a slam by the schools that came later, the Mahayana schools. And Trungpa Rinpoche always preferred, and many people do, to call it the foundational vehicle. Yeah, I think that's probably the best title. And so it has these two subdivisions: the Shravaka Yana, which is the first one you enter, and then as you begin to make progress, the Pratyeka Buddha Yana. Pratyeka Buddha means self-enlightened Buddha. These are individuals who are very much focused on themselves, and they achieve a certain degree of awakening. It's still beginning, but it's definitely profound. And in fact, a practitioner who achieves the realization of the Pratyeka Buddha Yana is called an arhat. And there are different levels of arhats. Arhats mean accomplished ones. And what they primarily accomplish, the main accomplishment of the arhat, is to understand the key doctrine on which all of Buddhism depends: egolessness. The fact that what we call an I is a fiction. It's not true. The I has no real being. And to discover this and to live this is to be free from a huge amount of suffering, because I is the repository of suffering. And we'll come back to that a little bit later. After the 2 vehicles of the Hinayana, the Shravaka Yana and the Pratyeka Buddha Yana, we move to the 3rd major vehicle, which is called the Mahayana, the greater vehicle. Now, just historically, the way these developed, give you a brief overview. After the Buddha passed in about 460, as near as anybody can tell, BC, the Sangha fractured, as Sanghas tend to do. And because people disagree about what he taught and what he said. And the period right after his death, for several centuries, in fact, was called the period of the 18 schools. Whether there were 18 or not, nobody really knows. A few of them have survived today. One of them, called the School of the Doctrine of the Elders, went south in India and was eventually taken over to Ceylon, where the name, which was called the Stavira Vada, Vada means doctrine, and Stavira in Sanskrit means elders, got translated into Pali as Theravada, which I think many of you are familiar with. The Theravada school of Buddhism spread from Ceylon throughout Southeast Asia, Burma, Thailand, and parts of Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, and Indonesia. Another major school of the Hinayana, one of the 18 schools, was called the Sarvastivada. Sarvastivada means the doctrine that all exists. And there's an explanation for why they call themselves that. And that school was located more in northern India. And it eventually was taken to Tibet by teachers who went to Tibet. And in Tibet, it became what we study as the Hinayana, the foundational vehicle, the lesser vehicle. At the same time, there were other schools that arose, which mostly haven't survived throughout the centuries. You have to realize that at this time in India, there was little or no writing. And what little writing there was done, as an act of piety. In fact, probably in the 5th century BC, there was no writing, pretty much, and terribly small amounts of it later, because it all had to be done by hand. And, what it would be done on was very questionable. It might be done on, leaves and, like papyrus and that kind of thing. And so the traditions were passed on orally, which explains, you see, why there's so many numerical categories in Buddhist thought. It's part of the reason why. It was a mnemonic to help people remember 6 realms, the 5 skandhas, and the 4 immeasurables, and it goes on and on like that. And one of the schools that arose at that time, and also new doctrines were appearing, because as the Sangha fractured, people come up with different versions of what they remembered or heard, and also they make discoveries. You see, in Buddhism, since there is no writ, there's no holy writ, like a Bible that casts the doctrine in concrete. Really, it's up to each individual, you and me and everybody else, to come along, receive the teachings, and then understand them in our own unique way. And eventually, inevitably, they change. And so one of the big changes that occurred probably around in the 4th to 3rd century BC was the appearance of a school called the Greater Sangha, the Mahasanghikas. And the Mahasanghikas came up with the doctrine of the Bodhisattva, a being who realizes not only the one-fold egolessness, that I don't exist, but they realize that not only does I not exist, but neither do you, neither does other, neither I nor other. Nothing exists, in fact. And this is the doctrine of Shunyata. And this first appears in the Mahasanghika school along with the doctrine of the Bodhisattva in primitive form. And this is what evolves into a new movement, as it were, called the Mahayana, the greater vehicle. They wanted to distinguish themselves from the Sthaviravadas and the Sarvastivadas by saying, we're better, so we're Maha, we're greater. And this is the vehicle of the Bodhisattvas. Now, at the same time, they also interpreted that greater to mean they're greater because the motivation of the Bodhisattva is greater than the motivation of the Hinayanist. The motivation of the Hinayanist is self-enlightenment for oneself. The motivation of the Mahayanist is to do benefit to the whole cosmos. And so it's the greater. vehicle. Now, nobody knows for sure when, but probably sometime after into the Christian era, there were tantrics practicing in the forest, and these are Hindu tantrics. But Buddhism became mixed up with Hinduism. And a lot of these wild yogis practicing in the forests developed what is now called the Vajrayana Tantra. And at first, these people were practicing in forests. They were singular, they were wild, they were disheveled, they were, not part of any monastic tradition. But eventually, probably starting around in the 6th to 7th century AD, the yogic tradition of the forests was brought into the monasteries, the Buddhist monasteries. And in those monasteries, it got a new name, and it was called the Vajrayana, the adamantine vehicle. Nobody knows for sure, probably around 700, this started happening. And now you've got this threefold division: the Hinayana teachings, the Mahayana, and the Vajrayana. And they're all taught. Now, at the same time, Buddhism was developing in India and in the rest of the world. After Southeast Asia, which happened around 3rd to 2nd century BC, around the time of Christ, Buddhism made its way across the vast desert, across on the trade routes into China, right around the time of Christ. Its entrance there was very problematic. Probably, my guess is, a lot of it had to do with the linguistic barrier. Chinese is utterly at the other end of the linguistic spectrum from Sanskrit. They are as unlike languages as you can possibly imagine. Sanskrit is highly inflected. Inflected means you modify a root to achieve different meanings. For instance, modify, take the word modify. In English, you say, I will modify, I have modified, I did modify. These are all inflections of the word modify. You can get modified, modifying, a participle. There is zero of that in Chinese. Likewise with nouns, if you ever studied Latin or German, there are endings that indicate in Latin not only gender of the noun, but its function in the sentence. So, the first word you ever learn is the word agricola, which means farmer in Latin. And agricola, agricolae, agricola. These are the nominative case when it's a subject, when the possessive case when it takes and it owns something, the dative case when it's an indirect object. Zero of that in Chinese. Chinese is utterly uninflected. So it had a very difficult transition into China, Buddhism, because Buddhism had grown up in a highly inflected language, Sanskrit and Hindi. Sanskrit is one of the most highly inflected languages in the world. And it's going into China with one of the most uninflected languages in the world. And the translations were very difficult until about the 4th century, when a great translator appeared, a Indian who went to China. His name was Kumarajiva. And he learned Chinese and he started producing really good translations. Prior to that, you had some hilarious mistakes. There was even a school that asserted that the ego actually exists in China. And anyhow, so at the same time, around the time of Christ that it went to China, it also started going after, well, actually, it went to Korea in about the 7th century, and at the same time to Japan, made its way across the water into Japan. Now, in the 7th to 8th centuries, it moved from India into Tibet. And what it was moving out of in India, Buddhism was a largely monastic phenomena. It wasn't a lay phenomena. People didn't, if you were going to be a Buddhist, you were a monk or a nun. And there were great, there were monasteries, but there were also these great universities, the most famous of which was called Nalanda University. And then there was another one called Vikramashila, and another called Udantapuri. And these housed thousands and thousands of monks and nuns who were studying the Dharma, as well as non-Buddhists. They welcomed non-Buddhists, and there was constant interaction between Buddhists and non-Buddhists. If you go to India today, and you go to the province of Bihar, where the Buddha achieved enlightenment at Bodh Gaya, you can go north of Bodh Gaya to where the Indians have excavated parts of Nalanda. And what they've done is they've dug down and they bring up the sun-dried bricks, enough to create a foundation of a building. And they've got a lot of buildings that have, you can see the foundations there, although it's only a fraction. And I went there once and my guide pointed to the horizon and said, that's how far it went. There were 10,000 people housed at Nalanda, the great Buddhist university. All of that changed in the 11th century when the Muslims invaded and took over northern India. The Muslims, as far as they were concerned, Buddhism was not welcome, nor was Hinduism, but it was impossible to stamp out Hinduism because it was a lay phenomena in the villages. Buddhism was a huge and easy target. All they had to do was destroy the monasteries, which they did. And Buddhism vanished from the face of India in the late 1000s. But by that time, it had already gone to all these countries, plus Tibet. It started going to Tibet. Well, again, this is funny because Tibet had no written language until the 7th century, when the famous king at that time, who decided he was a Buddhist, he had a Chinese princess for a wife who converted him to Buddhism, and he sent a minister to India to bring back a written language because they wanted to have writing. They didn't have any writing, can you believe? So this minister, his name was Tonmi Sambutta. He goes to India and he brings back Sanskrit, and they adopt it to Tibetan, and that's why Tibetan is written in the Sanskrit alphabet, although the sounds are utterly different. Just the way we could write, Latin or German in the Roman alphabet, and the sounds are very different than when we write English. So that's a quick overview of the spread of Buddhism. And then Buddhism moved to Mongolia in the 12th century. It had already gone to China, but in the 12th century it was taken to Mongolia. That's a whole another story. That's the Khans, Ogadai, Kublai Khan, and they're terrific stories about the life there as the Khans moved into China, across Central Asia, either killing or subjugating everything in their path, the Mongols. And when they got to the western edge of China, they got converted into Buddhism, which was quite a trick because they were utterly bloodthirsty and really knew no other way of life. And there are all these stories about they were camped on the western edge of China, about to take it over, which they did. In 1189, they established the Yuan dynasty, the Mongol dynasty. And they were camped on the western edge, and there were some towns around of Chinese people. And whenever they got they felt the population was getting too thick in these towns, too many Chinese, they just go round a bunch of them up and throw them in the river, drown them. And finally, but they also made a deal with the Tibetans. They said as they passed Tibet, and this is typical of the Mongols, they said to the Tibetans, and they did this wherever they went, they said, look, we can come in there and just kill you all, take over your country, kill all the leaders and just take it over. Or you can, admit that you're our vassals, send us a representative who's going to represent Tibet, and we will control Tibet through this representative. You'll pay us tribute every year. Tribute was what, was like money and food and all kinds of stuff that they had to send up. And we won't come down there and kill you all. And that's what the Tibetans agreed to. And they sent up a cleric. He was the head of the Sakya sect, the Sakya Pandita, he was called. His name was Pakpa. And there are all these stories of him interacting with the Khan. I forget which Khan, Ogadai or Kublai. I think it was Ogadai. And stories like the Khan was, the whole Mongol culture was so bloodthirsty and fierce, And then there's this Buddhist, and he's converting them and trying to convince them that they should pay attention to their karma. And he did eventually. And then it passed from the Sakya sect. See, the Sakya sect, he was called the patron-priest relationship. And the Sakya Pandita was eventually supplanted by the head of the Gelugpa sect, who was given the title by the Mongols, Dalai Lama. Lama is Tibetan for guru, and Dalai means ocean of Dharma in Mongolese. And that's how the Dalai Lama got his title. And he was both the political and the spiritual head of Tibet, appointed by the Mongols. Eventually the Mongols passed away, but it still remained that the Dalai Lama was the spiritual and political head. Today, our current Dalai Lama has renounced his political role. He doesn't want to have it. But the Tibetans, of course, still give it to him. But he says he's not going to be a political ruler anymore. So the 9 yanas that we're looking at here were taken to Tibet in around the 7th century, theoretically. This king who brought Buddhism in, Songtsen Gampo, he brought it in, but it didn't really take. It wasn't for 100 years or more until a king appeared. His name was Trisong Detsen, and he is legend. Very, very important in the history of Tibetan Buddhism, because he became a devout Buddhist, and he brought in a famous Indian teacher named Shantarakshita, who was a Mahayana teacher. Actually, Shantarakshita was a Vajrayana practitioner. But among people who are really into the traditional approach to the Vajrayana, you don't talk about it. You don't talk about your Vajrayana practice. You know? And Shantarakshita didn't, and he basically billed himself as a Mahayanist. He came into Tibet and he began to establish the first monastery, Samye, in Lhasa, for Trisong Detsen. And the problem was that the local deities, the indigenous religion of Tibet is called Bun. It's usually spelled P-O with an umlaut N, and pronounced Bun, or B-O with an umlaut N. And the story goes that Shantarakshita and he ordained some Tibetans as monks. This is all in about 700s, early 700s. And they would build this monastery by day, and by night, the Bun deities and demons would tear it down. And I mean, I figure indigenous culture, you know. And finally, Shantarakshita goes to Trisong Detsen and basically tells him, you need someone with more mojo than me. And there's this fellow in India named Padmasambhava, and he's got it. You should send for him. Padmasambhava, you know, we did a chant for him, for those of us who were here for the meditation in the northwest of the land of Udayana. Oh, have I got something for you? I forgot. Udayana. A digression, okay? A digression. About, I'm not sure how many years ago, 10, 15 years ago, I got a call from a friend who told me, I was living in New York back then, and I hadn't moved up to Westchester yet, Frank. And he said, there's this fellow coming to town. His name is Ian Baker, no relation to me. And you should have him over for drinks. He's a really interesting guy. And I did. Turns out Ian grew up in Westchester. At some point, he went to Nepal as part of one of those study programs where kids go over, and he was their teacher, you know, and they're studying Nepalese culture and you know, living there for a while, and he's teaching them. And during a break, according to his book, he wrote a book called The Heart of the World. And during a break, he wanders off into the hills on a trek, and he meets a yogi, as he describes it in the book. Doesn't say who. And receives teachings, Buddhist teachings, for the first time from this yogi. Doesn't say what. Although from the faint way he describes it later in the book, I'm getting that it's Dzogchen, the highest of the teachings. And then he describes how this yogi tells him about a thing called the Bayul. The Bayul are hidden lands that exist in the Himalayas, on the ground. The journey to these lands and the people who live in them, it's sort of like Shangri-La myth, although it's not. And Shangri-La is another story altogether. But it's like that. And the people who live in these lands are very, very beautiful and peaceful. And there are only 4 entrances to the Bayul, and they're hidden. And the journey to the Bayul is both a spiritual and a physical one. And Ian sets out to find the Bayul. And he wrote up his story in a book called The Heart of the World with black and white photographs, which was published about 10 or 15 years ago. I read the first part of it. I thought it was interesting. You know, I put it down. Currently, they've republished the book, this time with color photographs. And Ian is on YouTube plugging it. This time, he's pulling out the stops. The yogi that he studied with, I know who he was now because he mentioned his name. His name was Chotrul Rinpoche. Chotrul Rinpoche, during his lifetime, he died a couple of years ago, was probably the greatest of all the Tibetan Dzogchen masters. And this was Ian's teacher. He also studied with Dujum Rinpoche, who has passed too, who was head of the Nyingma sect. And he's very tight with the Dalai Lama. So this is his creds. But the book is stunning. The photographs that he shows you, it's worth watching. Go to YouTube and ask for Ian Baker, The Heart of the World. And you get these pictures, these photographs. The geography and the people are a world that very few people have ever seen. And it's the world, it's the deep world of Tibetan Buddhism, of Tantrism that went to Tibet. One picture that he showed me that knocked me out, a picture of a cave. They're always horrible looking, these caves, where a great yogi meditates. This was where Yeshe Tsogyal meditated and achieved enlightenment. She meditated there for years. This cave is at 18,000 feet. 18,000 feet. I climbed for years. Climbers know that above 16,000 feet, you either have to have oxygen or you have to titrate how long you stay there because the air doesn't support human life. And this cave is at 18,000. Now the Tibetans, you know, get used to it. They've been living up there. Trungpa Rinpoche grew up at 14,000 feet. And he has a very much different constitution than you or I doing that. So I really recommend this video. I went thinking, you know, I'll watch it for a little while and then I'll turn it off. I was gripped. I stayed the whole time. It's an hour and a quarter. And then there's 45 minutes of Q&A. And Val and I came back the next night and listened to the Q&A. It's the photographs and the stories are just really worth it. A window into a world. So anyhow, Buddhism goes to Tibet. Padmasambhava arrives. He travels by way of, and Yeshe Tsogyal, by the way, was Padmasambhava's consort in the 8th century. They lived together, traveled together. She became a great teacher in her own right and also planted many terma, hidden texts, his teachings. And she was a powerful, powerful personage in Tibet. And he went to what is now Bhutan. In those days, those countries didn't exist. Bhutan, Nepal, Sikkim, they all appeared in the 19th century. But he went to that area and meditated there in a famous cave called Tag Tsang. You should Google Tag Tsang if you haven't ever seen a picture of it. It's a pretty amazing place. It's on the side of a cliff. And now there are sort of very primitive buildings built there. And you can go and do a retreat there or visit there. Trungpa Rinpoche went there in 1968 at the invitation of the Queen of Bhutan and did a long retreat. He went there, you know, for some weeks and received the terma, which we have and which we chant on the first Thursday of every month. It's called the Sadhana of Mahamudra. Came to him as a mind terma from Padmasambhava. Padmasambhava went there with Yeshe Tsogyal in the 8th century and assumed the wrathful form, or his wrathful form, which is indestructible, wrathful one, Dorje Trollo. And he's depicted in Tankas in this form, riding on the back of a pregnant tigress, that's her. And she's got the jaws of the corpse of Rudra, of ego in her, the corpse of Rudra in her jaws, and it's dripping blood. The whole thing's terrific. So he meditated there, subduing the evil forces in Tibet, before he got there. And then he went to Tibet and planted Buddhism. There were a number of other great teachers who went to Tibet at the same time, primarily another teacher called Vimalamitra, who also brought Dzogchen, and Padmasambhava brought Dzogchen. Dzogchen meaning great perfection. Now, back to the 6 yanas of the Vajrayana, or the 9 yanas of the whole path. Hinayana, those 2. The Mahayana, now we've got 3 yanas. The Mahayana is divided into 10 subdivisions called bhumis, and I've sent you a list of them. Each one of them has a corresponding transcendent virtue, which the bodhisattva, because once you enter the Mahayana, you are now a bodhisattva. And the bodhisattva practices these transcendent virtues. They come to him or her, and they develop in them as the person progresses along the path. From bhumi 1 to 2 to 3. The first bhumi, you see, is the discovery of Shunyata, of emptiness. Huge step on the path. It's really, now you've gone beyond the Pratyeka Buddhayana, you have discovered the twofold egolessness, and you have entered the realm of reality. There's still a little faint ego watching and saying, look what I've done. But basically, you've transcended suffering at that point. You're past the kind of suffering that you and I normally endure. And the first bhumi is called great joy for that very reason, pramudita. And the paramita, the transcendent virtue associated with it, is generosity. Because having discovered emptiness, having discovered utter egolessness, all one does is practice generosity, of being kind to other people. And there's a progression through these 10 bhumis, and there are key hallmarks, which we're not going to go into today. And at the end, at the 10th bhumi, when the person goes beyond that, then they go into what's sometimes called the 11th bhumi, or the Vajra indestructible samadhi, absorption, the indestructible absorption. This is enlightenment itself. And this is the entrance proper into the Vajrayana. So there are 2 ways you can go into the Vajrayana. You can go in that way, where you actually are everything that the Vajrayana is describing as you go in. Or, like us, and me, and I presume you, many of you, who haven't yet achieved enlightenment, we can practice Vajrayana practices with the mind of a Hinayanist or a Mahayanist. And that's acceptable, because they are very powerful, those practices, and will pull you along much faster. The Vajrayana is called the fast path. It speeds everything up. And the fastest of the stage of the Vajrayana is the last one, Dzogchen, great perfection, also called Ati. So in the Nyingma scheme, there are 6 subdivisions of the Vajrayana, which I've given you on that list. In the Kagyu scheme, there are 4. The first 3 are the same as the Nyingma, and then they get to one that finishes it called Anuttara Yoga, and that's on your list too. So this chapter starts out with talking about how the 9 yanas enable people psychologically, personally, physically, to surrender to the Buddha's teachings. It's so interesting he puts it that way. We're surrendering because we're giving up our egos. All that suffering that's attendant on the ego, and pride, and worry about me, 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 me. And that's what's given up along this Buddhist path. He mentions the 3 marks of existence: impermanence, suffering, and egolessness. Suzuki Roshi once was asked to sum up Buddhism in just a couple of words by his student David Chadwick, and Chadwick reported that he didn't expect Roshi to actually do it. Roshi turned and said, "Everything changes." Very essence of Buddhism. Now, there are 2 ways to understand change. One is that each one of us is aged. Some of us have lost our hair and gotten wrinkles, and the cells in our body are changing, slowly over the years. That's one understanding of change. Another understanding of change, though, and actually the more important one for understanding emptiness, is that you turn your head and everything changes. The feeling in your neck, what you see, the way you hear, your bodily sensations, thoughts come and go in the instant, in the moment. The five knowables and the objects of mind, the five senses, are all arising and passing away like reflections on water, like reflections in a mirror. That's the most profound understanding of emptiness, and it's the one that will serve you the most when you come to practice and bring your awareness into this present moment, letting it rest in this space in which these six knowables, sounds, sights, smells, tastes, bodily sensations, and mental objects, are arising and passing in the instant. Just now, they're gone. As soon as they arise, they pass. That understanding will bring emptiness, Shunyata, the fact of non-existence. Existence, the idea that this glass has some real existence, that I have some real existence, is just that, an idea. It's a story, a fiction that's told in words in terms of what we actually experience. Now I'm looking over here, now I see the glass, it comes and goes. So these are that's the first one, one of the three marks, anitya. The second one is egolessness, which we're not going to go into a lot tonight, the fact that I don't exist. And the third is suffering. And this is the one that he really wants to spend the time on in these readings, that we are carrying this huge burden. What is the burden? As long as one believes in an I, that I exist, one is constantly consumed by worry and attempts to solidify and make good one's imagined existence. And it's painful because our existence is constantly being challenged, constantly slipping away. It's impossible to hold on to. We age, things are taken from us, we're insulted, we lose the people we love, all kinds of things. Our minds are constantly changing. We can slip into depression. The belief in an I carries with it a huge burden of suffering. It's because we're constantly worrying about me and my existence, me and my well-being. It's a constant concern. So he talks about this. There are three types of suffering. One is the fundamental suffering that's with us all the time. It's like a background feeling of heaviness, of worry about me that is even there when you're having a good time, when you're having a great time. And there's this feeling of it won't last. This subtle suspicion that it won't last, which is true, it won't. So there's suffering that just is the fundamental suffering. The second suffering is called the pain of change. We had happiness, and you got something really good, and now it's changed and it's gone. You were healthy, now you're sick. You were rich, now you're poor. You were loved, now you're lonely. The pain of change. Things are constantly changing, and it's painful. And the third one, it sounds so Jewish. It's the pain of pain. It's like, you get sick And then you have an accident and you break your leg. And then the cast doesn't work right and you get your leg gets infected. And then they have to lance the infection and the lancing doesn't work, and you got to go back and get it lanced again. It's just pain after pain after pain after pain. It goes on like that. What does he say? You had an auto accident and suffered fractured ribs, and then you catch pneumonia, and so on. Those are the three kinds of pain. So the fundamental one, the pain of change, the fact that everything changes, and then the pain of pain on pain on pain on pain. Yeah. So this second reading I found very difficult. This is from the Life and Teachings of Naropa. And again, it's about pain. This fundamental reading. And this has been retranslated. There's a better translation than he was working from, or than we were reading back then. And basically the point that he wants to make in these pages is that pain is with us all the time. What does he say about the refrigerator? He says, write it on your refrigerator. Pain never goes. We will never be happy. There's a mantra for you. It's worth repeating, he says. We'll never be happy. And the veil, he talks about the veil to enlightenment, is wanting to get rid of pain. That's another pain in itself, wanting to get rid of pain. Whenever we want to try and improve things, to make them different from what they are in a way that's better for us, less painful, that is pain. And that, in fact, is the fundamental pain of ego. When we do Tonglen for people, you're breathing in their suffering, breathing out happiness to them. The main thing we're breathing in is that they would like to get rid of their pain, the wish that things were otherwise. That is the fundamental suffering that we're breathing in from this person. Somebody's dying. They're on their deathbed, and you're breathing in their wish that things were otherwise. The teachings say it's possibly to go into absolutely everything cheerfully, including death itself. So the first veil is wanting to get rid of pain. Second veil is regarding pain as an obstacle. And he says, if we accept the burden of pain as truly burdensome, then its heaviness does not exist anymore. If you identify with rock, you don't exist, you become the rock. It's just like when you are meditating and you go out with the breath and you just become the breath, and the breath dissolves, and then there's just awareness. In that moment, ego and the pain is gone. The pain of ego, the pain of I. Because I is like a second thought. The body's here, the world is there, and then this I pops up. Trungpa Rinpoche called that I a number of things, ego, of course, the watcher. And he called it the hitchhiker. I always loved that one because it's hitching a ride. There's you, and there's that voice that says, I don't like this, I want that, I wish, I hope, I fear. And that's that voice, it's a hitchhiker. Then he talks about hope. And this is a huge theme on the Buddhist path, giving it up. That hope blocks everything. Hope has to do with suffering, because what hope says is, I don't like the way things are, I hope they'll get better. And that's suffering. That's dukkha. In fact, I've got, if I can find it at some point. Oh, well. Somebody actually gave me a sticker that says this. I saw years ago on a bumper sticker on a car in Boulder. I was walking down the street. On its bumper sticker, it said, "Now that I've given up hope, I feel so much better." And that's really the slogan, giving up hope, because hope is the foundation of the complete distortion of spirituality. And it screws up everything. If you have hope when you meet a teacher, a guru, what a guru wants, a teacher wants, above all, from a student, is openness. Openness, complete honesty, complete and utter communication without any hidden agenda, being who he or she is, fearlessly, courageously. Hope, if you have hope when you meet the teacher, you're hoping you're going to get something. You're hoping that things will turn out a certain way, and it screws the whole thing up. For there to be proper devotion between the teacher and the student, hope has to go. Hope will spoil it all. He says, I'm looking forward to this one. There is enormous challenge and excitement in hopelessness. You begin to develop a sense of humor. That's funny, don't you think? Just that idea. And then he says, we're always looking for remedies, but the only and best remedy is hopelessness, which is your own product, no cost. Eventually you've seen it all. Now it's time to give up hope. Even give up hope of attaining enlightenment. That's interesting. Means really coming present. So that's all I'm going to say tonight. And we can have a discussion. Who would like to speak? Yes, Cliff, you look like you've got something.
I didn't want to be the first to speak, but yeah, I can't help but smile every time I hear these teachings, because it sounds so depressing and, you know, just a bottomless pit. But it's not. It's a recipe for freedom and liberation. And that's, you know, what it's about. And, you know, you give these teachings without explanation to new students or people that are new to Buddhism, and you watch them turn green and literally walk out the door shaking. And, you know, then it's like, oh, that Buddhism's not for me. It's all about suffering and this. But, you know, there's the other side of that. And that's that people don't express, which is, yes, that's all true. And then there's the way out of it is it's like, the problem is the self, because it's like, as long as there's a self, there's going to be suffering. So for the self, it's hopeless. I don't mean hopeless in a good way, like you described it, because I agree with that, you know. But for the self, it's a lost cause, because the self can never be happy, because for two reasons. One, the self doesn't exist, and the nature of the self existing creates suffering in itself. So the self could never be happy, and likewise, the self could never be enlightened. The self could never be awakened, because there is no self to be awakened. So when you, I don't, you know, we talk, we use the words to drop the self, but we're really not dropping the self. We're not giving up the self. We're not surrendering the self, because there is no self there in the first place. So there's nothing to lose. It's just an illusion. I hope you agree with that, John, or
Sure.
do you see it? Okay.
Sounds good to me.
It sounds good, right? So it's once you drop the self, there's just that natural Buddha nature, and it's just that joy, happiness, and liberation and freedom. And that burden is no longer there because there's no one to be burdened. So it's pointing at one direction, but on the other hand, you can say, don't forget, this is the door to, you know, the gateless gate. This is the door to freedom and joy and happiness. So you got to take both sides, you know, like they say, it's walking the middle path. You know, it's not that nihilism, you know, it's life itself and beauty and love and compassion and all of those things. And I think you did say it. You know, you talked about moments of true joy and happiness when you're not dealing with that idea of self or the watcher or that ego. And we all experience that also.
We do.
Yeah, but it's temporary, and it's not noticed because we haven't developed the capacity, you know, the mind to notice it, because we're not looking for it. So it just goes unnoticed. It's like a gap. But we do notice the suffering, don't we? So
yeah, we do.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the essential, I mean, for everybody, for all of us, is meditation practice, combining meditation and some study, Vipassana practice of meditating and bringing your mind out into space, not interior with the eyes closed and focusing on an object, which is a way of sort of achieving a kind of trance, peaceful state. That's good in the beginning, you know, to help people. But once you have become familiar with that, that's called shamatha practice, then you have to move on to Vipassana, because Vipassana is what opens the door to insight of any kind into the nature of reality. And it has to do with going out and being aware of the environment, being aware of space, and of giving up ego when one does that. I just tell you a story. When I first met Trungpa Rinpoche, he gave a talk one day about egolessness, and there was a Q&A, and I was sitting on the floor and he was in the chair, and during the Q&A, I asked a question which I've heard many times. I said, well, don't you sort of need ego, you know, while you're on the path, sort of provisionally, you know, you got to pay the bills and, you know, give the cabbie the fare and all that stuff. He leaned forward in his chair and bellowed at me with his eyes. At least it felt like his eyes were popping out of his head. That's the way it felt to me. Ego is a lie. That's one to write on the refrigerator. Ego is a lie. And the discovery of that, really, for each one of us, is a doorway into a different way to be in the world. To be in this world, in a world in which one has discovered that one was living an illusion, was living a myth, and it's gone. And what is revealed in the absence of that, the real world, this is why the first bhumi is great joy. You know, the first bhumi entrance in the Mahayana path. So it's really beautiful teaching, and it's amazing that it's there and accessible, available to us if we practice and if we can connect to the lineage. There's this powerful stream of teachings that takes form in living human beings. And I'm not touting myself. What you need, what it takes is a teacher who has the capacity to communicate egolessness, let's say, and a student who has the receptivity to be open to it. And when those two things meet, magic happens. And the world changes. Who else? Oh, we got fireworks outside here. Hi, Karen.
Hi. Hi. I have a logistical question. You mentioned the land of Udayana, and you were talking about the the lands found by Ian Baker, and I was wondering what was the connection between those?
Uddiyana and the lands, the Bayul. That's an interesting question. Uddiyana is a real place, as near as we can tell. And it's probably, Ian says the same thing, and I've been hearing this for years. It's probably an area of Afghanistan, which is called the Swat Valley. This is an extraordinary place, the Swat Valley, because for a number of reasons. One of the least important is that there is a mountain at the end of the Swat Valley called Nanga Parbat that has the highest vertical rise of any mountain in the world. It rises from its base to its top 20,000 feet, and that rise is visible from the floor of the valley. Everest only rises about 8,000 feet, from its base to its top, although it's higher than Nanga Parbat. But Nanga Parbat's an 8,000 meter peak. That's one thing. The other thing about it is, about the Swat Valley, it's the western terminus of the Silk routes. There were two major Silk routes that went across Central Asia, to the north and the south of a vast desert area that has since somewhat disappeared because over the centuries, it's been millennia, it's gotten greener. But at the time of Padmasambhava, it was a huge desert called the Taklamakan. And one route goes from the Swat Valley north of the Taklamakan and ends at the western edge of China in a town called Dunhuang. And the other trade or silk route goes from the Swat Valley and goes south of the Taklamakan and ends in Dunhuang. So Dunhuang and Taklamakan were huge repositories of stuff left behind by travelers. And I have a friend I haven't seen in years, Deborah Shasta Klimberg. She and her husband Max, before the Troubles, used to go to Afghanistan all the time. They're archaeologists. And she said it's like a layer cake, all the different cultures that have been there and deposited their remains, and you dig down through one layer after the next in the Swat Valley. Now, it's impossible to go there pretty much for an archaeologist. Dunhuang is an amazing place. In the 7th century, there were monks there, Buddhist monks. There are caves, and they were living in these caves in Dunhuang on the western edge of China. All these travelers were coming across the Silk routes to Dunhuang. And the monks in the caves, it was an act of piety, because there was no printing press yet, to copy, manuscripts. Paper or anything to copy it on was in very short supply. So they took whatever they could get, bills of lading, travel diaries, letters that travelers left behind, this kind of stuff, and copied the sutras on the backs of these documents. In the 7th century, for some reason, nobody knows, at least I don't know why, there was an exodus. All these monks left, and they left the caves and they sealed them, sealed these caves. The caves had Buddha images and they had these texts. In the late 19th century, a French archaeologist named Pelliot discovered the caves, and he opened them, and he found all these documents written on the backs of bills of lading and travel diaries and all that stuff. What was interesting was not so much the sutras, the religious documents. When he flipped them over, he saw languages that nobody had ever seen before, from cultures that had risen and died in Central Asia over the millennia and were gone. Isn't that amazing? And some of them for which there was, and I think still is, no Rosetta Stone, no key. I mean, talk about historic romance. It's just terrific stuff. So anyhow, that's where Uddiyana is, the Swat Valley is near. Ian says this, and I really recommend his video. I thought it was terrific. I could watch it again almost. There are 3 levels of, you might call them hidden lands if you want. You wouldn't really call them that. One level is the heavens, like the Akanishta, the above all heaven, the Tushita heaven, the Devachen, the heaven of great bliss. These are Buddha heavens, Buddha fields. And really what they are is mental states that you can go to through practice. You can do it in death. You can go to these places, and they're mental states. They're not enlightenment, but they are very conducive to achieving enlightenment. That's what a heaven like that means. They're up there somewhere. They're ethereal, right? Connected with ethereal Buddhas, not physical. Beneath them, in sort of the hierarchy, is Shambhala. Shambhala, this mythic kingdom that the Buddha supposedly went to, taught the Buddhist teachings there, that everybody got enlightened, and it became so pure, that kingdom, that it just sort of rose off the earth, figuratively speaking, and disappeared into the Akash. And it's somewhere out there, and you can get to it. It's a spiritual journey. And Trungpa Rinpoche wanted to recreate it on earth, Shambhala. But that's an ancient myth. And then the third level are the Bayul. And the Bayul actually exist physically on this planet in places that are so wild. Wait till you see these photographs. It's not places that I've ever been. I mean, these, Ian traveled down looking for this. I'll tell you what I hope you won't be offended. He traveled down the Tsangpo River Gorge, which is the deepest river gorge in the world. And it turns into the Yangtze River when it enters China. He eventually found one of the entrances to the Bayul, but by the time he got there, his expedition was so decimated that he couldn't cross this raging torrent and try and get to this hole which he could see up in the wall. And you'll see a picture of it and tell me what you think it looks like. I mean, it's perfect for Tantrism. And it's up there on the wall. Wow. He shows you a picture of that hole from across the river. I don't know if he ever did get to it. I haven't finished the book. Great stuff. Who's next? Somebody. Trip, you have anything you want to say? From down in Georgia?
Down in Georgia. Yeah, I mean, I'm sitting here kind of reworking some of my questions about despair. And one of the things I just realized, we're down in a very intense region with COVID, and trying to kind of think through the physical suffering element. I know that when, I have a cold, sitting is difficult. When I feel under the weather, being present is extremely difficult. And I guess if you're in a physical state of suffering, like a chronic or even a very intense acute state of suffering, what is there to help an individual practice? In a religion, you have faith, right, that things are going to get better. But in the case of, what we're going through down here in Southwest Georgia, things are not going to get better. Things are probably going to get worse. And some people are getting sick, and they're going to get extremely sick. So what is there in terms of not going from hopelessness to despair, or not living in despair in these kinds of circumstances? I don't know if that makes sense, but when somebody is physically ill, how to maintain the practice? Are there any insights into that?
I think you have to take the illness as your practice, as your object of meditation, your awareness, the whole thing. This is why Vipassana is so important, because Vipassana allows us to have an environmental awareness that includes everything. Everything. I'll just tell you this story. I've told it so many times, so if you've heard it, forgive me. The reading that we read tonight was translated by a friend of mine named Michael Cohn, Sherab, his Tibetan name was, student of Trungpa Rinpoche. And he just passed, Michael did. And he passed very cheerfully, which is appropriate for this story I'm going to tell you. Years ago, we were living in Boulder, and Michael's father was dying in Chicago. So Michael went to Trungpa Rinpoche and told him that he was going to go back to Chicago to say goodbye to his father. And what could Rinpoche recommend that he tell his father? Rinpoche told him, you could tell him to cheer up.
Really?
There are so many stories, Trip, about great teachers who go into death cheerfully. You know? And it's I remember when Roshi was dying, Suzuki Roshi, he died of stomach cancer. A great irony, in a way. We all knew that Roshi, see, Trungpa Rinpoche's favorite movie was a movie called Woman in the Dunes. But we also watched Roshi's favorite movie, which we knew was a movie called Ikiru, Kurosawa movie. Ikiru is about a man who dies of stomach cancer. Beautiful film. I really recommend it. Gorgeous. And it was Roshi's favorite movie, and he died of stomach cancer. And Trungpa Rinpoche went and saw him in the hospital before he died. And he came back, and we asked him how Roshi was doing. And he said he's dying like a true Buddhist. And someone asked, what does that mean? And he said, he's curious about his own death. Not easy to do, but maybe that's what we're practicing for.
Mm-hmm.
So that all those things of life, the highs and the lows, we're not subject to them. We're not their slave, at their mercy.
Is it fair to say that despair is then really just an extreme version of holding on to hope?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Is that
Definitely.
so? It's total surrender, letting go, being in the present.
Total surrender. That's what he starts this chapter with. Our reading, he says, he talks about the 9 yanas being the path to total surrender. Yeah. The path to surrender. Surrendering to what? To reality. Giving up the ego. The ego always wants things to be different, some imaginary state.
Thank you.
He used to look at us and he would say, please give up hope. Please give up hope. Things are as bad as you think they are. It's taken me years. I mean, you know, when I heard him say that, I'm thinking, huh?
Right.
It's like in Zen, they say, cheer up, it gets worse.
Where do they say this?
In Zen.
In Zen? Cheer up, it gets worse?
Yeah, cheer up, it gets worse.
Who's talking? Oh, it's Charles. Yeah, that's wonderful. I've never heard that one. That's good. Yeah. Yeah, Zen is wonderful. Cheer up, it gets worse. Okay, that's terrific. Graham.
Now that was me. I guess that's enough for me tonight.
Okay. Anybody else? Teresa?
John?
Yes.
Tony?
Hi. Hi.
Hi. I have a friend who had occasion to spend quite a bit of time at the Zen Center in San Francisco. And I remember being incredibly amused when she told me that their favorite movie was Groundhog Day, which they would watch relentlessly over there.
Okay.
So, yep, another one of those. So a few snippets I'm taken away was fascinating about hope. So hope, in a sense, you talked in the last set of, in the last series about that the cardinal sin of Buddhism was self-improvement, or the feeling or the need for self-improvement. So it seems to me that there's a relationship there between hope and self-improvement, that things are not how they should be, and, you know, that you want them different, and so you aspire to some form of hope that they will change. My question also is that it appears that hope then has a direct relationship with expectations. Would it? Do you believe that, or would that be a fair thing to say, that hope and expectations are sort of bedfellows?
Sounds right to me.
Right.
Anybody else want to chime in on this? Yeah, absolutely.
I have another path that teaches me that
It does
it's
what?
kind of. I have another path that talks about the fact that an expectation is a premeditated resentment, which is a pretty kind of
Good.
accurate sort of thing to say. But so what else came up for me? Oh yeah, I went to Bamiyan. You were talking. Yeah, I was in Bamiyan in the early 70s. I was there.
When the statue was still in the...
Yeah, they were there, and I climbed right up.
Wow.
You climb, there were monks' cells all the way up, and you could climb to the height of the head and look out at the most beautiful valley that I think it's still seared into my mind, just how perfect it was. And then there were paintings on the wall in the different cells that went up. But at the time, I think the Indian government was rebuilding them, or doing the best they could to rebuild them. This was early days, but and then of course later on, unfortunately, they were blown up by the Taliban. But it was a kind of a powerful experience.
I'll bet.
You talked about those valleys, the Swat Valley, and
magical place. What Tony's talking about is these ancient statues that date back, I don't know, 1,000, 2,000 years.
Yeah.
The Bamiyan statues, they're the tallest Buddha statues in the world. They were. And just a few years ago, they were blown up by the Taliban, destroyed. Today, well, they took photographs, found photographs of them, and they've turned them into a light show that's projected, so that there's the image, the illusion of the statues being there in light. They haven't tried to actually rebuild them.
I have quite a few photographs from that period as well. If you'd be interested to see them at some point, I could possibly send you some pictures of what I saw there.
Absolutely, I'll show them if you wish. I can show them in chat on in the evening. It'd be terrific to see them.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much for a really enlightening evening, John. Thank you.
Enlightening. Well, everybody, the floor is open if you want to say something. And
John, I just wanted to say thank you and hi, everyone. It's Teresa. I'm sorry I was late and I missed the meditation. My work got in the way and I was, anyway.
That's okay.
I had an interesting trip to Thailand years back, and one of the gentlemen said, it's every man in Thailand is a monk for 90 days at some point in their life. And usually it's like before they get married or when their parents die, but at 90 days in every man's life, they're a monk, and it's pretty interesting. So we went to monk chat, and my mom went to touch the monk, but you're not allowed. You're not supposed to touch them. I don't know. Then they have to go to, I guess, almost the equivalent of Catholic reconciliation or something like that. If a woman touches them while they're practicing, or it was kind of weird. But anyway, just figured I'd throw that out there and say thanks for letting me join in late.
Oh, wonderful to have you. Must have seen you go see the reclining Buddha in Bangkok and.
I went all over. Oh, I saw so many Buddhas.
Yeah,
there were Buddhas and temples everywhere.
Yeah.
It was terrific. That's what prompted the interest in starting to go to the Westchester Buddhist Center. That was I went to Thailand in like 2008, and it was interesting. They had a coup, and they had this whole stuff. We avoided all the, not so great things that were going on, and but it was a terrific trip. It was terrific.
Mm-hmm.
Especially Thai massage for 2 hours for 400 baht, which was like $14. It's great.
Yeah, Thai massage.
Mm-hmm.
Well, okay, everybody. Let's close with the dedication of merit. Is that okay?
Sure.
And wonderful to see you all. Oops, not that. Here we go. By this merit, may all obtain omniscience. May it defeat the enemy wrongdoing from the stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness, and death. From the ocean of samsara, may I free all beings. By the confidence of the golden sun of the great East, may the lotus garden of the Rigdon's wisdom bloom. May the dark ignorance of sentient beings be dispelled. May all beings enjoy profound, brilliant glory. Good night, everyone.
Good night. Thanks.
Oh, one more thing. If anybody wants to talk about their practice, I'm available. We can do it by Skype, Zoom, or phone. So that's on the table. And also, if you can make a donation to New York Buddha Dharma, be great. Pays for Zoom and the web work that the web designer does and that kind of stuff. So thank you all. Great to see you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Good night.